It was at that point that he came, started walking to the front of the bus, and he had the head in his hand, and he just looked at us like this and dropped it on the ground, like totally calm. I think I was the first one to really realize what was going on and just screamed like, "Stop the bus, someone's getting stabbed, everybody get the hell off."
Thank you for watching Why I Killed You TV. Please do not forget to like, comment, share, and subscribe to this particular YouTube video. I would greatly appreciate it. We're going to be talking about another tragic case. On a quiet summer evening in 2008, what should have been a normal Greyhound bus ride across Canada turned into one of the most gruesome and horrifying crimes in the country ever seen. A young man's life was cut short in the most brutal way imaginable, and the aftermath would spark national outrage, heartbreaking debates, and a lifetime of grief for a devastated family. Today we're going to be talking about the tragic case of Tim McLean and Vince Li, the Greyhound bus beheading.
They hate you. You're gonna die. I don't want to do this.
July 30th, 2008, bus 1170 was traveling along the Trans-Canada Highway, headed towards Winnipeg, Manitoba. Among the passengers was Tim McLean, a 22-year-old carnival worker who had just finished a job in Edmonton. He was sitting near the back of the bus listening to music, texting friends, and likely looking forward to being home. By all accounts, Tim was happy, adventurous. He was an adventurous young man, full of life and optimism for the future. At the rest stop in Brandon, Manitoba, another passenger boarded the bus, Vincent Li, a 40-year-old male who quickly took a seat near the front. Nothing seemed unusual. It was described by other passengers as quiet, even polite. But that normalcy wouldn't last for long. As the bus continued down the highway, Li suddenly moved to the back of the bus, taking the empty seat that was right next to Tim. Tim barely reacted. He had his headsets on and he was resting his head against the window, unaware of the danger sitting right beside him. Without any warning, Vince Li produced a large knife and began stabbing Tim around his neck and his chest. Passengers immediately thought it was some type of fight or some type of altercation. But as the horror unfolded, it became clear this was something much worse. The bus driver immediately pulled over the bus and evacuated all the passengers. They could only watch from the roadside in horror as Vince Li continued to attack him on the bus. Li then decapitated Tim and chillingly held Tim's severed head up to the bus window and showed it to the screaming and traumatized onlookers.
As the 30-plus once passengers of Greyhound bus 1170 stood on the side of the Trans-Canada Highway about an hour west of Winnipeg, they watched as absolute horror unfolded on the bus before them. With the massive knife he'd just used to stab Tim countless times, Vince Li began to saw and hack at the neck of McLean's lifeless body. After a while, Li stood up to his feet with the bloody knife in one hand and Tim's head in the other.
Wow.
People fainted. They screamed hysterically. Some others couldn't hold it back and vomited beneath themselves. Teenagers from the bus began trying to get videos with their phones while younger children cried as they witnessed a trauma that would undoubtedly mark them for the rest of their lives. A trucker driving through the area stopped and helped the fearful people defend themselves with crowbars and hammers. Then suddenly Li began to make his way toward the front of the bus. But the driver, the trucker, and another passenger acted quickly, attempting to close the bus door, blocking Vince Li from leaving the Greyhound or attacking more people. And just as the door slammed shut, like something out of a horror movie, Vince's knife-armed hands shot through the slit in the door and brandished wildly at the people on the other side. They quickly evaded the scene to put distance between them and the crazy man on the bus. They were uncertain as to what would happen next. Would Vince get out and come for them? They were sure he would. But he never came out. Law enforcement were en route, but they were nowhere near the now bloody crime scene. While people outside could do nothing but wait and watch, Li paraded Tim's decapitated head up and down the aisle of the bus, showing it off like some kind of sick trophy. And then, with still no sign of the police, Lee's actions on board the Greyhound intensified. He cut open Tim's chest and tore out his organs. He took out Tim's heart, his lungs, his liver, and finally ripped out his intestines. He took these items and strung them out all over the bus, and still the other passengers could do nothing but watch in shock. But it wasn't over. In full line of sight, Vince Li devoured both of Tim's eyes and 1/3 of his heart. He then cut off Tim's nose and ears. He taunted his audience by smelling the severed parts and licking Tim McLean's blood off his own fingertips. Li had also brought plastic bags with him. These were for storing the pieces he'd cut off. He actually planned to take parts of his victim with him. It was haunting. It was cruel. It was unthinkable in every way. The passengers outside the bus were witnessing what can only be described as malignant evil. At around 9 p.m., authority and emergency services arrived in bulk and immediately contained the scene while attempting to reason with Vince Li. But negotiations proved to be fruitless. It was no use. Vince Li simply wouldn't comply. He stated, "I have to stay on this bus forever," and then continued to dissect Tim McLean for hours. Non-present SWAT team members later critiqued the attending officers for not taking Li out and putting an end to the situation sooner. And call me cruel, but I agree. Li was armed. He'd already killed, decapitated, cut up, and ate a guy. He was dangerous and threatening, but some do-gooders believed he was deranged and shooting him would have been unjust and unnecessary. Well, I suppose if you take a moment to really think about it, shooting Li wouldn't have done anything more than leave a ton of unanswered questions for the poor McLean family and the rest of the traumatized passengers on bus 1170. At about 1:30 a.m., after hours of the police seemingly getting nowhere, Vince Li finally made a run for it after breaking out one of the windows on the bus. But it was over quickly as he was met on the other side by the shock of a police taser and the gnashing teeth of a heroic K-9 officer. The crime scene was finally analyzed as the traumatized witnesses were questioned. Tim's nose, ears, and tongue were all found in Li's pockets.
Oh my God.
Li, who injured himself in the killing and cannibalizing of Tim McLean, was taken straight to the hospital to treat his injuries. I know. Very Jesus of them. But it's standard protocol. Treat injuries first. As anger-triggering as it seems, it too makes more sense than our emotions initially allow us to realize. The threat at the time was neutralized. Preservation of the well-being of Vince Li was the only thing that was going to lead to answers. So at that point, officers were simply abiding by policy, and that was the right thing to do. Greyhound representatives had to take the passengers to a local store and replace their clothes because everything on the bus was now evidence. Then at 3:30 p.m. the next day, the exhausted passengers finally arrived home in Winnipeg to the worried arms of their loved ones. Tim's mother, Carol, was informed by her ex-husband that Tim would not be coming home.
Wow.
She reportedly learned what happened on the bus the night before while listening to the radio. She prayed over dinner that it wasn't her son. She was understandably devastated beyond conceivable belief. Some of the passengers from bus 1170 have never recovered from what they saw that day, and I imagine they never will. Not fully. How on earth could you? Even some of the cops and emergency responders that day still haven't shaken off the post-traumatic effects of what they saw. And all Tim McLean's family could do was pray and push for justice to be served to the evil devil on that bus that destroyed their angel. Imagine for a second that that was your family member. How could you process this? What would you want to happen to Vince Li? And what would happen to Vince Li? Why did he do what he did? And just who the hell is he?
During the interrogation, it was clear that Vince Li was severely mentally ill. Psychiatrists diagnosed him with severe schizophrenia, untreated, stated that he was hearing voices that Tim was a threat to him, even though Tim had never said a word to him while they were on the bus. Li was charged with second-degree murder, but after a psychiatric evaluation, he was found not to be criminally responsible due to his mental illness. Instead of prison, Li was committed to a psychiatric institution where he would then undergo treatment. Over the years, this decision would spark enormous controversy. Li was granted increasing freedoms, supervised outings, and then unsupervised outings, eventually full release. In 2017, less than a decade after the killing, Vince Li was granted an absolute discharge, meaning he was no longer subject to any monitoring or restrictions. He even legally changed his name to Will Baker and now lives freely within the community. For Tim's family, however, especially his mother, the court's decision felt like a second betrayal. She spent years fighting for changes to the Canadians' mental health laws, arguing that victims' families were being denied true justice. The case sparked national debates about the balance between compassion for mental illness and accountability for violent actions. Many Canadians still feel conflicted about it to this very day. Tim's life was stolen in the most brutal way imaginable, and the scars left behind will never fully heal. Today, we remember Tim as a vibrant young man whose life should have been filled with laughter, dreams, and a future, but however, it was tragically stolen from him.
It was at that point that he came, started walking to the front of the bus, and he had the head in his hand, and he just looked at us like this and dropped it on the ground, like totally calm. The three of us had weapons from the trucker's truck there, and we just stayed outside while he tried to get out the door, telling him, "No, stay put, stay there, don't try to come out." He tried to get the bus working, and the bus driver disabled the bus somehow in the back. I'm not sure how he did it. It was at that point, I think, that the police showed up and kicked us off, got us to the back, the end of the bus there.
How were people reacting?
Some people were puking, some people were crying.
Were people running? Were they screaming?
Yeah, everybody was running, screaming off the bus. Like when it happened, I think I was the first one to really realize what was going on and just screamed, like, "Stop the bus, someone's getting stabbed, everybody get the hell off." The people at the front of the bus didn't really understand what was going on, so it almost turned into like a trample scene there, and everybody trying to get off the bus.
They hate you. You're gonna die. I don't want to do this.